The power of controlled silence. You speak too quickly, because silence makes you uncomfortable. That discomfort doesn't feel like weakness, it feels like urgency, like the need to clarify, to explain, to make sure nothing is misunderstood. But underneath that impulse is something far more subtle, a lack of control over your own internal tension. The moment silence appears, you feel pressure to fill it. And in that moment, without realizing it, you begin to give away more than you intend to your thoughts, your position, your emotional state. What most people fail to notice is that silence is not empty. It is active. It forces attention, creates pressure, and shifts the dynamic of interaction. When you rush to speak, you relieve that pressure for yourself, but also for everyone else. You make things easier, smoother, more predictable. But in doing so, you remove the very tension that creates influence. Because influence often exists in the space between what is said and what is withheld. There is an emotional tension that drives this behavior. When silence lingers, your mind starts to anticipate outcomes. You imagine awkwardness, misinterpretation, even rejection. And to avoid that, you move quickly to restore control through words. But what feels like control is actually surrender. You are not choosing to speak, you are reacting to discomfort. And when your actions are driven by the need to escape a feeling, they are no longer fully yours. The psychological realization here is precise. The first person to speak often reveals more than necessary. Not because they intend to, but because they are trying to stabilize the moment. They provide context, justification, detail, anything that reduces uncertainty. And while that may create temporary ease, it also gives others something to read, interpret, and respond to. Your words become information. Your tone becomes a signal. Your urgency becomes a pattern. And once patterns are visible, they can be anticipated. Controlled silence disrupts this completely. When you are able to sit in that space without rushing, without reacting, you begin to observe instead of expose. Others start to fill the silence themselves. They speak more, reveal more, adjust their behavior in response to your stillness. And while they do, you remain uncommitted, unreactive, and therefore difficult to read. This is not about manipulation. It is about maintaining control over what you choose to express, and when you choose to express it. As you begin to practice this, the experience changes internally. Silence no longer feels like pressure, it feels like position. You are not trying to control the outcome through constant explanation. You are allowing the moment to unfold while you remain steady within it. That steadiness becomes noticeable, not in an obvious way, but in how others begin to slow down around you, how they become more careful, more attentive, more aware of your presence. The shift in mindset is subtle but decisive. You stop seeing silence as something to fix and start seeing it as something to use. Not to dominate, but to stabilize. Not to create distance, but to maintain clarity. You begin to recognize that speaking is only powerful when it is intentional, and that intention requires space. Without space, words lose weight. With space, even a few words can carry impact. Your identity begins to reorganize around this awareness. You are no longer someone who reacts to silence, you are someone who holds it. You don't rush to fill gaps. You don't feel compelled to explain every thought. You choose when to speak based on clarity, not discomfort. And in doing so, your presence changes. It becomes quieter, more deliberate, less predictable. Not because you are trying to appear controlled, but because you no longer need to prove that you are in control. The invisible signal of emotional control: the less reactive you are, the more influence you gain. Most people assume influence comes from what you say, how confidently you speak, or how well you argue your position. But influence, at a deeper level, is shaped long before words are exchanged. It begins with how you respond, especially when something unexpected, uncomfortable, or emotionally charged happens. And in those moments, most people reveal more than they realize. What often goes unnoticed is that reactions are not just expressions, they are signals. Every visible emotional response communicates something about you: what affects you, what triggers you, what matters to you, and where your limits are. These signals are not interpreted consciously most of the time, but they are absorbed. People begin to build a quiet understanding of how you operate. They notice what makes you tense, what makes you defensive, what makes you explain yourself. And once that pattern becomes familiar, your behavior becomes predictable. There is a subtle social pattern at play here. Humans naturally adjust themselves around stability. When someone reacts strongly, it creates movement in the environment. Others either escalate, withdraw, or adapt based on that reaction. But when someone remains composed, especially in situations where a reaction would be expected, it creates a different kind of pressure. It slows things down. It forces others to reconsider their own behavior. Not because they are told to, but because the usual pattern has been disrupted. The emotional tension lies in your instinct to respond. When something challenges you, whether it's a comment, a tone, or a situation, there is an immediate internal movement. You feel the impulse to correct, to defend, to explain. And that impulse feels justified. It feels necessary. But in that moment, what you are really responding to is not the situation itself, but the discomfort it creates inside you. And when your response is driven by that discomfort, it becomes reactive rather than intentional. The psychological realization is precise. Every reaction reduces your control over the interaction. Not because reacting is inherently wrong, but because it reveals timing, intensity, and emotional alignment. It gives others a reference point, and once they have that reference, they can anticipate how you will behave in similar situations. Even if they never consciously think about it, they begin to adjust their approach around what they've learned from you. When you begin to control your reactions, the entire dynamic shifts. You don't suppress emotion, you regulate its expression. You allow yourself to feel, but you don't immediately translate that feeling into action. You create a gap between what happens and how you respond, and in that gap, something important happens. Clarity. You are no longer tied to the urgency of the moment. You are choosing your response rather than being pulled into it. As this becomes consistent, your behavior starts to feel different to others. Not in an obvious or performative way, but in how steady you remain. Situations that usually provoke reactions begin to lose their influence over you. And because you are no longer reacting in predictable ways, people around you begin to recalibrate. They become more cautious, more observant, less certain of how to affect you. And that uncertainty shifts the balance of control. The mindset begins to change from expression to awareness. You stop seeing reactions as necessary responses and start seeing them as optional outputs. You realize that not everything needs to be addressed immediately, and not every emotional movement needs to be displayed. You begin to prioritize composure over expression, not to hide, but to maintain control over your presence. Your identity evolves through this process. You are no longer someone who is shaped by the moment. You become someone who shapes the moment by remaining unchanged within it. Your behavior becomes less about reacting to what happens and more about choosing how you remain, regardless of what happens. The discipline of holding back, you feel the impulse to respond, but something tells you to stay still. That moment is where control is either strengthened or lost. Most people don't fail because they lack awareness, they fail because they cannot tolerate the tension of not acting immediately. The urge to respond feels urgent, justified, even necessary. But that urgency is often emotional, not rational. And when you act from that place, you are not in control, you are simply reacting faster than you can think. What goes unnoticed is that the strongest form of control is not in what you do, but in what you deliberately choose not to do. Holding back is not passivity, it is restraint. It is the ability to interrupt your own impulse long enough to see clearly. Most people never develop this. They move from stimulus to response almost instantly, guided by emotion, habit, or expectation. And because of that, their behavior becomes predictable. They react in patterns, and those patterns slowly define them. There is an internal conflict in this process that most people avoid confronting. On one side, there is the desire to maintain composure, to act with intention, to remain steady. On the other, there is the pull of immediate expression, need to respond, to correct, to assert. That pull is strong because it promises relief. The moment you react, the tension disappears. But what replaces it is something less visible and more lasting: a loss of control over the direction of the interaction. The reason discipline changes everything is because it shifts your relationship with that tension. Instead of escaping it, you begin to hold it. You allow the discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. And in doing so, you create space to observe, to understand, to choose. That space is where control lives. Without it, your actions are tied to the moment. With it, your actions become deliberate. There is a principle here that is often overlooked. Time filters distortion. Immediate reactions are almost always influenced by incomplete perception. You respond to tone, assumption, or interpretation owed necessarily to reality. But when you pause, even briefly, your perspective begins to stabilize. You see more. You understand more, and often, you realize that the response you were about to give was not aligned with what actually matters. Mental boundaries are built in this space. Not through force, but through clarity. When you hold back, you begin to notice what deserves your attention and what does not. You stop responding to everything equally. You become selective. You allow some things to pass without engagement. You choose when to speak, when to act, and when to remain still. And that selectivity changes how others interact with you, because your responses are no longer automatic. As this becomes consistent, your internal experience shifts. The impulse to react does not disappear, but it loses its authority. You begin to recognize it as a signal, not a command, and that distinction changes everything. You are no longer pulled into action, you are choosing whether to act at all. That choice restores a level of control that most people never experience, because they never pause long enough to access it. The transformation is not dramatic, but it is decisive. You don't become distant or detached from everything. You become precise. Your actions carry intention. Your responses carry weight. You are no longer filling space, you are shaping it. And in that shift, you begin to operate from a place where your behavior is not dictated by what happens around you, but guided by what you decide matters. The authority of being unreadable, you reach a point where people can't figure you out. And that changes everything. Not because you become mysterious on purpose, but because you stop reacting in ways that make you easy to interpret. Most people reveal themselves constantly through their expressions, their tone, their need to explain, their urgency to be understood. Over time, these patterns create a clear emotional map that others can follow. And once that map exists, your behavior becomes predictable, and predictability quietly reduces your control. What most people don't realize is that being easily understood is not always an advantage. It creates familiarity, but it also creates exposure. When your reactions are consistent and visible, others begin to anticipate them. They adjust their behavior around what they expect from you, not necessarily in a calculated way, but in a natural, adaptive way. And without noticing it, you begin to move within the expectations others have formed about you. The shift begins when you detach from the need to constantly express yourself. You stop explaining every decision. You stop reacting to every perception. You allow moments to pass without correcting how you are seen. At first, this feels unnatural. There is a discomfort in not clarifying, in not making sure you are understood. But that discomfort is tied to a deeper habit of managing how others perceive you in order to feel stable. As you begin to release that habit, something changes in the dynamic of your interactions. When people cannot immediately read your response, they slow down. They observe more carefully. They become less certain of how to approach you, and that uncertainty shifts the balance of control. Not because you are trying to confuse or manipulate, but because you are no longer providing constant feedback that others rely on to navigate you. There is an underlying principle here that defines long-term influence. The less emotional leverage others have over you, the more stable your position becomes. Emotional leverage comes from visibility, what you react to, what affects you, what you reveal without restraint. When those signals become limited, others have less to work with. They cannot easily predict how you will respond, and without prediction, influence becomes more difficult. This is where inner authority consolidates. You are no longer trying to be fully understood in every moment. You choose what is expressed and what is withheld. You allow silence to carry meaning. You allow your presence to exist without constant explanation. And in doing so, you reclaim control over your own narrative, not by hiding, but by being intentional. Over time, this creates a different kind of stability. You are less affected by external reactions because you are no longer adjusting yourself to meet them. You observe more than you respond, you listen more than you explain. And in that shift, your interactions become less about managing perception and more about maintaining alignment with yourself. As this identity becomes consistent, the effect is quiet but unmistakable. You are no longer easily influenced, not because you resist everything, but because you are not driven by the need to respond. Your presence becomes more grounded, less reactive, more deliberate. And in that grounded state, you begin to recognize something that most people overlook. That control was never about saying more, it was about revealing less than others expect, and choosing exactly when it matters,